family stories tell us who we are. My family was pioneers. They came to Idaho a long time ago. And the stories I have heard about those days tell me who I am. My grandma had a sourdough start, and every day she made hotcakes or rolls or something. And she would tell me stories about that sourdough start that at that time she said was 100 years old. And I would ask her questions about why she needed this sourdough start. And she told stories about how back then there were no stores to go to buy bread. There was no store to go to buy yeast or sugar. So we made do. We used what we had and we survived. And I got these stories that I came from hardy stock and that we were strong people who endured hard times. Family stories tell us who we are. Today's gospel is the family story for the Christian faithful. It tells us who we are. This story from the Last Supper to the crucifixion, we call that the Passion, because it is that story of God's strength and courage and power. It starts with that Passover supper, that celebration of God delivering the Israelites from slavery. And then Jesus going outside the city for the night, and the arrest in the night, and Peter's betrayal not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then that trial before the council, where he is convicted, ironically, of being the Son of God. And then his trial before Pilate, where he is convicted, ironically, for being a king. And then Pilate does, as the powerful often do. He manipulates the crowds until they're the ones yelling, "Crucify him," so that later they will be tortured by the way they participated. And Jesus is crucified, and Jesus dies. Doesn't just go to sleep. It's not a magic trick. Jesus dies. He breathes his last, and he is laid in a tomb. This is a story that tells us who we are. This is a story that shows us such a difference between God incarnate, Jesus, and every person, lest we think that somehow we contributed to the saving, redeeming act of Christ. We hear about this faithlessness of all the people. It's easy to see in Pilate and in Herod with their violence. It's easy to see in the chief priests and the council in the way that they condemn. It's easy to see in Judas who betrayed. But you know those crowds who were following Jesus? They're gone. The disciples he had just shared the Last Supper with, they're off at a distance. Even Peter, who said he would never, ever betray and ever leave, betrays him, denies him 3 times. Even the women were off at a distance. Every person failed. But our rejection of God is powerless against the love of God. Because the story also tells us whose we are. That we belong to the one whose faithfulness never wavered. We belong to the one whose integrity never budged. We belong to the one who came right up against worldly power then and now, wealth and force. And he went up against that power, and it couldn't touch him. He was the one who resisted without aggression. He was the one who was victorious without violence. We belong to the one whose compassion was sticky, and all it took was that much faith from a criminal hanging on a cross beside him, for this outpouring of compassion. And so today we enter Holy Week. When we hear this story, who tells us who we are, and we hear it in real time. Today, we hear about Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, where the crowds were yelling Hosanna, and there was a parade and a party, and they were welcoming him as a king. And then in the days to come, as Jesus teaching in the temple for those days, and then on Thursday, when we gather here on Maundy Thursday, here at Trinity at 7 o'clock, we will hear the story of the very first time the words were spoken, "This is my body, do this for the remembrance of me." And we will hear the story of the washing of the feet and the way Jesus took everything we knew about master and servant and turned it on its side, that it is God and us. And at the end, we will strip the altar, reminded of this, hearing the story of Jesus going out and the arrest in the night and the trials and the crucifixion. And then on Good Friday, we gather here at Trinity at 7 o'clock, where we remember, where we are honest, that we cannot say they crucified Jesus. We tried to destroy God. There will be no communion. And then on Easter, on Saturday night at the Easter Vigil, as the sun goes down, we will again, spoiler alert, we will again remember about how God did not stay dead, that Jesus rose, that we lack the power to destroy God. And we will gather with Grace Episcopal, and we will tell the story in the night, the story of salvation and the light coming into the darkness. And we will celebrate the Lord's Supper together again. We will celebrate that we lack the power to destroy God, that God is more powerful than us, that God is more powerful than our sin, that God is more powerful than our rejection. So today we enter Holy Week, beginning the story that tells us who we are.